Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. And for those that aren't quite back yet, welcome back. Come on in. So Robert Edsel is recognized as one of the world's foremost advocates for art preservation and the recovery of cultural treasures missing since the Second World War. He is also the leading authority on the monuments men and women, the soldiers, scholars who saved millions of works of art and cultural treasures from the destruction of war and the theft by the Nazis. Robert has written 4 nonfiction books on these heroes, including the #1 New York Times bestseller, The Monuments Men, which of course inspired George Clooney's movie of the same name, The Monuments Men. Now, Robert's the founder and chairman of the Monuments Men and Women Foundation. The nonprofit organization continues the heroes' mission by locating and returning art and cultural treasures to the rightful owners. It also uses their legacy to raise global awareness about the importance of respecting and preserving the world's shared cultural heritage. The Monuments Men and Women Gallery inside Liberation Pavilion is a result of an idea Robert Edsel developed and pitched as a museum trustee more than a decade ago. Hope you've had an opportunity to see Liberation Pavilion, but also really to peruse those incredible galleries. Now, since then, Robert and the foundation really work closely with the museum on each aspect of the gallery, probably each comma, each semicolon, word count. Oh, wait. A little flashback. Among his many honors, Robert's been awarded the Texas Medal of Arts and the National Archives Record of Achievement Award, which recognizes an individual who has fostered a broader national awareness of history and identity by using original records. So please join me in a warm welcome for Robert Edsel.
Thanks, sir. Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and I want to get right into it so we leave a lot of time for questions. We are here today and enjoy the freedom of being here because of the service of World War II veterans and others who have served our country in uniform. And I'd like to ask all of you to stand so we can recognize you for your service to our country. I'd also like to thank the leadership and the staff of the National World War II Museum. We have an outstanding relationship with them. They've been so supportive of our work, and likewise, we've tried to pull our fair share of the weight. And we're very, very proud about this most recent development, the Monuments Men and Women Gallery at the Liberation Pavilion, and I hope all of those who are here today who have not had a chance to visit will do so, and those that are watching on television or online will make their way to New Orleans and see this great treasure house of history, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Lastly, thanks to all the historians and researchers that are here and watching online. We all are part of a relay race trying to work off the accomplishments and information provided by each person, building on that to write about the past, to better understand the present, and hopefully guide us to make better decisions about the future. The Monuments Men and Women, a never-ending story, began for me years ago in Florence, some 27 years ago. And I was standing on one of the bridges in Florence, the Ponte Vecchio, and I wondered how, during the most destructive war in history, 65 million lives lost, did so many works of art survive, and who were the people that saved them? And I started asking friends that I'd made living there, and they all said, I don't know, that's a great question, what's the answer? And I said, well, you live here, you should know. And they said, well, I never thought about it. I wasn't embarrassed that I didn't know the answer, but I was hugely embarrassed. I'd never thought to wonder, because clearly, not just a few paintings, but tens of millions of cultural objects, library books from the most important libraries in Western civilization, paintings, documents, cultural treasures, had to have been moved during the war on the road over these 6 years. The story begins in Florence, interestingly enough. In 1938, when Adolf Hitler makes his first state visit to Italy, he spends about 5 days traveling through Italy, through Naples, Rome, and then the last 10 hours of his trip he spends in Florence, and he spends 2 hours in the museums in Florence, wandering the halls of the Uffizi and Pitti Palace, looking at works of art collected by the Medici family. And it's an inspiration of an idea, realizing the great collections of the Medicis, and he returns to Berlin and begins making drawings by his own hand of a vision he has to rebuild his hometown in Linz, Austria. And at the center will be this cultural complex, and the key feature will be a museum of works of art that he believes will be one of the great museums, known as the Fuhrer Museum. Now, lest you think this is an overblown story, the photo I showed you before was work he was doing in 1938, and this was a photo taken 3 months before he commits suicide, deep inside the Reichschancellery, looking at the scale model of Linz and the Fuhrer Museum, hearing these horrific war reports, and he's lost and mesmerized in thought about how great this museum's going to be. And 3 months later, of course, the day before hours before he kills himself, he dictates his last will and testament, and specifically mentions that the works of art that he's collected in his lifetime go towards this museum. So it's certainly his first inspiration as a teenager to be recognized for his knowledge about art, and one of the last thoughts he has before committing suicide. In a break with history, men and women led by leaders in the United States cultural scene, aware that the United States was going to be fighting this war, had the presence of mind to realize if we weren't careful, we might win the war and destroy so much of Western civilization and history in the process. These were men and women, museum directors, art historians, artists, scholars. Some were artists themselves who volunteered for military service. Their average age was about 40. They were never going to be drafted. Many of them had families. They all had accomplished careers. There were 27 women in all by the time it was all over who wanted to do what they could do to help win this war. And they all felt like that they could do this. One of the key figures in Italy was an officer named Dean Keller. Now, Keller was an artist, a portrait artist, and also a professor of art at Yale University. And he left at 42 years old his 3-year-old son behind to put on a uniform and go to Europe and try and preserve the cultural treasures in Italy. He came across a villa outside Siena in Florence where he came across this painting by Botticelli that's from the Uffizi Gallery. So these are the extraordinary scenes that they're seeing, finding works of art that have been moved outside the cities out of fear of Allied bombing causing fires, and then finding themselves stuck in the war zone, unable to be moved back into the cities, and sitting there leaning against bare walls of villas. Another key figure was a guy named George Stout. Stout was 47 years old. He'd actually seen military service in the last year of World War I. And he was convinced, because of the Spanish Civil War, that there was going to be a Second World War. He was already preparing pamphlets by the time of Pearl Harbor about how to protect cultural treasures from the new technologies of firebombing. And it was not only his idea to create what he envisioned being cultural preservation officers, but also to volunteer for service. And Stout was in all the difficult spots in Western Europe. Anytime they made a discovery of a salt mine or a cave where there were works of art, the call went out to find George Stout. And this is him helping elevate a sculpture by Michelangelo, the Bruges Madonna from Bruges, Belgium, the only sculpture by Michelangelo to leave Italy during his lifetime, which Stout found wrapped in the same burlap mattress that the Nazis had wrapped it up in when they stole it in September 1944. Lest you think these guys are sitting in an office somewhere telling other people what to do, 2 were killed during combat. 2 out of the 80 or 90 or so that were actually somewhere near the front lines. Captain Walter Hutchhausen, who was American, and British Major Ronald Balfour, who both were killed in March and April 1945, respectively, in the closing days of the war. I mentioned that there were women who served. Of course, they couldn't serve during combat, although many of these women did serve in the Women's Army Corps. And then when the call went out at the end of the war, at the end of war in May 1945, the call went out for volunteers because the Monuments Men were finding tens of thousands of paintings and other works of art in caves and castles and more than 2,000 hiding places, and they needed people with any expertise in the arts, and they needed drivers just to try and move these things out into safer places. Two of the key figures were a French woman named Rose Valland, standing there on the left, and an American Women's Army Corps Captain Edith Standen, who was one of the registrars for a great collector in the United States, Joseph Widener. They had the very, very difficult task, along with the Monuments Men, of working through hundreds of thousands of paintings. This is a photograph of just one of the rooms where these paintings were taken, masterpieces by the greatest artists in the world, that they had to sort through and try and figure out what is it, what country was it taken from, and begin the process of returning these works of art to the countries from which they belonged. Another key figure was Mary Regan Quisenberry. Mary was in the first graduating class of the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, and then served in organizing General Toohey Spots' headquarters and made arrangements for stenographers, secretarial pool, organized German prisoners of war to cook for them. And she was an important figure too. Now, at this point in time, I normally would walk through and describe for you some of the consequences of the Monuments Men and Women finding these things in caves and other places, and would describe for you why in a war that claimed 65 million lives, protecting works of art and cultural treasures was important. But I thought, given this audience, we could do one better than me, and that is to ask someone who was there and witnessed these things to tell us his perspective about what took place. And in that regard, then, I would like to introduce the Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower.
We have recently emerged from a bitter conflict that long engulfed the larger nations of the globe. The heroism and sacrifice of men on the fighting lines and the moral and physical energies of those at home were all devoted to the single purpose of military victory. Preoccupation in a desperate struggle for existence left time for little else. Now we enter upon an era of widened opportunity for physical and spiritual development, united in a determination to establish and maintain a peace in which the creative and expressive instincts of our people may flourish. The welcome release from the fears and anxieties of war will, as always, be reflected in a resurgence of attention to cultural values. It may seem strange that a soldier, representative of the science of destruction, should appear before a body dedicated to the preservation of man's creative ideals as expressed in art, and should be urging support of the Metropolitan Museum. Even though we acknowledge that the soldier's true function is to prevent rather than to wage war, yet his necessary association with lethal weapons would seem to imply the existence of an unbridgeable gulf between his philosophy and that of the artist. Perhaps this is so. Certainly I lay no claim to artistic temperament. But I do know that for democracy, at least, there always stands beyond the materialism and destructiveness of war the ideals for which it is fought. Thus, the awful test of war is primarily a testing of the spirit, and so it is possible for the fighting man to experience in war a definite spiritual growth. These same soldiers have seen the destruction of priceless artistic treasures. But, and perhaps understandably, this fact has served only to increase their respect and veneration for civilizations of the past. They tried, within, sometimes beyond the limits of military prudence, to preserve and protect these products of man's creative instinct. But war is essentially destruction. An army at war must incessantly hurl destructive force at the enemy. And in this process, much of the world's heritage in art has been inevitably damaged and lost in the late global conflict. I am grateful to the directors of the Metropolitan Museum for their generosity in having accorded me an honorary membership for my small part in protecting these monuments. The credit belongs to the officers and men of the combat echelons whose veneration for priceless treasures persisted, even in the heat and fears of battle. Another view of the fate of art in war was presented to our soldiers when, at long last, we penetrated to the heart of Nazism. There, in caves, in mines, and in isolated mountain hideouts, we found that Hitler and his gang, with unerring instinct for enriching themselves, had stored art treasures, filched from their rightful owners throughout conquered Europe. Alongside bar and minted gold were found paintings, statues, tapestries, jewelry, and all else that the Nazis knew mankind would pay much to rescue and to preserve. Some of this has been restored. Some, not easy to identify, is still under the care of the captors.
When I started to understand the scope of the story, I decided to write a book about it, and the first book was Rescuing Da Vinci, which was a collection of photographs to try and tell the story visually, not having any background as a writer, historian, really just a mutt, a combination of skills, my best skill being knowing how to get something done. And I went to publishers in New York and I heard, nobody cares about World War II stories anymore. And I said, I don't think that's right. And they said, well, you know, it's been done before. And I said, hey, save me from myself. Tell me the name of the book and I won't do it. But I knew it didn't exist, and that's where it all began. But I realized after having done that, that I really had only scratched the surface because I hadn't tried to find monuments officers that were still living and hear their story. And so that really set me on a journey to go out and try and do that. And then in the interim period, with the United States-led invasion of Iraq, the mistakes we made concerning the failure to protect the National Museum of Baghdad and other cultural treasures there, and the scorn that befell the United States as a consequence, while I was still trying to learn about who the monuments men and women were, I knew enough to know that it was astonishing to me, with us having set the gold standard for the protection of cultural treasures with a handful of men and women under the most excruciatingly difficult circumstances and no tools of technology, that certainly we could have and should have done a better job in 2003 than we did. And for that reason, I created the Monuments Men and Women Foundation to really, in a way, following in the steps of Stephen Ambrose and Nick Mueller, by having an organization that could be there to capitalize on all the artifacts that I was starting to come across, and of course oral histories and other information from interviewing them. We had an extraordinary moment in 2007 when President Bush invited us to the White House to present to the National Endowment for the Humanities Medal to the Monuments Men and Women Foundation for our efforts to try and preserve these heroes' histories just at the twilight of their lives, and we had 4 monuments officers with us. And since then, there have been a lot of hours that have gone into trying to raise visibility about who these men and women were. The mission of the foundation is set out to be to honor them first, because by the time they came home in 1951, the world was engaged in a new war, the Cold War. And no one was there to say thank you. And the monuments officers, like other World War II veterans, they weren't interested in that. They just wanted to get back to their lives and resume their careers. By the time they did come home, they had accomplished the return to the rightful owners of more than 4 million stolen objects. 4 million stolen objects, and 1 million objects that belonged to German museums that they were the guardians of until Germany could get back on its feet and rebuild its museums. And this was a break with centuries of civilization. For the first time, the victors said to the victors, do not belong the spoils of war. They should be returned to the countries from which they were taken. The film that was mentioned earlier, the Monuments Men film, was an objective because we were hoping to raise global awareness about who these men and women were. And of course, be it good or bad, nothing in the world accomplishes that more effectively than a feature film. And it was a great moment for us to be able to film a unique opportunity in the refectory of the Santa Maria della Grazia Church in Milan, where the Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci is painted. And it was so miraculous that that painting survived a British bomb that landed about 90 feet away and destroyed the east wall of the factory and the roof, and surely by a miracle did not destroy the work of art. George Clooney asked me in the course of filming, what else could we do? And I said, we need to get in and see President Obama. And he made that happen. And I was very pleased that I could take a guest, and I took Nick Mueller with me. And we had an extraordinary time there. And it was important, not from an ego standpoint, but the President of the United States is the Chief Executive Officer of the corporation we know as the United States of America. When the President of the United States says something's important, people get to it and understand there's a different kind of priority. And that was the second part of the mission, was to preserve these men and women's legacy and begin to put it to use. Let's reestablish the high bar for the protection of cultural treasures. And at this screening of the film at the White House, the President invited people from Department of Defense, State Department, the leaders of the museums in Washington, and it sent a message that we understand now about what we were able to accomplish in World War II, and we're going to do a better job in the future. As a consequence of that, I started being invited to go on military bases and speak to our civil affairs officers that were preparing to be deployed overseas, to try and speak about who were these predecessors that they were following in the footsteps of, what were the challenges that the Monuments men and women faced decades ago that might be useful to them as they're trying to think about how to accomplish mission today. We worked very hard, 9 years, with no lobbyist. I was in Washington more than 100 times in every single Senate office and many of the congressional offices, trying to persuade members of Congress to award the Monuments men and women of all 14 nations, a total of 350 or so by the time the war was over, but never that many serving at once, with our nation's highest civilian honor, the Congressional Gold Medal. And that was a great moment to have 4 different Monuments men and 1 Monuments woman there to receive that. Here most recently, another remarkable achievement, the dedication of the Monuments Men and Women Gallery, one of the feature exhibits at the Liberation Pavilion. And I think it's important for everybody to know, while it may appear the sequence of this was Write Book, Hollywood Film Museum comes along and creates an exhibition, that's not what happened. This happened as a result of the entrepreneurial spirit of this remarkable institution. An idea I suggested to Nick Mueller in 2009 that he immediately embraced, recreating a salt mine effect and having our various exhibitions inside there. And it had the support of the board, it had the support of key trustee Bob Hayes, and Patty, his wife, who stood up and said, this is important and we're going to make sure it happens, and the support of the board since then. And so it's a great moment to see that that happened before all these other fantastic things that have happened to the foundation. This happened long before that. It just took a lot longer for it to materialize, and we're really, really proud of what we've all been able to achieve there, and I hope you'll have a chance to walk through there. And the honoring of the men and women of the Monuments Men are not finished. The foundation will next year publish Rose Valland's personal book, her memoir, that actually was the inspiration for the movie The Train, in English for the first time ever. So everyone's going to have a chance to read about her experience in her own words in English, and we're very, very proud about that. The Monuments Men and Women Foundation, in the course of traveling around speaking to the Monuments Men and Women, to speaking to veterans, family members, others that serve with them, I started having some of the things that happened to Stephen Ambrose. People were giving me things. We had someone contact us and said, I have 2 brown leather albums. I said, where'd you get them from? Well, my uncle was in Berchtesgaden, he picked them up at the Berghof. So he had it in a gym bag. He pulls it up and drops it on the table, and I said, let's be a little more gentle with it. And he pulls these 2 things out. These were taken from Hitler's office there at the Berghof, and they were beautifully stenciled in this calligraphy, Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg. This is the looting organization named after Alfred Rosenberg that's gone around and deliberately looted works of art in France from Jews. And you see the most pernicious part of it, this label down in the lower right-hand corner. It says R437. R is the code for the Rothschild family. That's the 437th object they've stolen from the Rothschilds. Rothschilds lost about 6,500 objects. All the families in France, the Jewish families, each had an inventory number, and they took these magnificent photographs. These books were presented to Hitler. Christmas time, on his birthday, Rosenberg was trying to show what a good job they're doing. And he would flip through these things like mail-order catalogs, trying to decide which works of art did he want to have for his museum. We found 4 of these albums. There were 39 the Monuments Men found at the end of the war. They were the primary exhibit at the Nuremberg trials for the portion of the trials prosecuting theft and destruction of cultural property. The Monuments Men and Women have found 4 since then, the only 4 that have surfaced. But there are more out there. There are more out there, and we're hoping to find those. We've had paintings that we've found. This painting belonged to Queen Victoria. You see the royal symbol there. I was on a radio show, on Glenn Beck's radio show, talking about the discovery of something else, and by the time I made it back to my office, we had someone call from Oregon and say, my aunt's got 2 paintings that she brought home from Germany. She was there during the war. These might be things that you're looking for, and in fact, these have been taken from German collection, and we returned those to Germany. The 4 albums I mentioned earlier are at the National Archives in Washington. We had another guy show up at our office in Dallas. He had 3 paintings. Walked in, and I said, where'd you get these from? Well, my uncle won them in a poker game. Great. Why now? And he said, well, we saw the Monuments Men film, and we thought maybe we should do something with them. Well, they had museum labels on them. They've been taken from a museum in Dessau, Germany. That's a really beautiful story. Our German researcher contacted the archivist there. She was a lady, about 65. She'd worked there since she was 20. Never, ever had a phone call about any of the 700 paintings that disappeared from their museum, most of which I'm sure were taken by Soviet Red Army troops. And my German researcher described the names of the paintings and the inventory numbers, and the lady started crying uncontrollably. And she said, I need to call you back. And she called back about 45 minutes later and said, all these years we've given up hope. No phone calls, no leads, no nothing. And now you're calling and telling us 3 of these things you've found. So it was a really, really dramatic moment to be there, and they asked me to come and return these things personally. It was very, very special. We've found library books. These are 7 books, some are as old as 500 years, that were taken from the library in Naples, the 3rd oldest library in Western Europe. And in fact, they were found by an American soldier. The Germans had gone through these barns where the museums had evacuated things to try and get them out of the cities to keep them from being burned up. They ripped through these crates hoping to find gold or something more fungible, and they found old books. So they threw the old books on the ground. And this soldier picked up these 7 books, he put them in his rucksack and came home. And starting in the 80s, he was 80 himself. He was trying to find a way to return them. He didn't know where they belonged to, he just knew he took them from Italy. He contacted the Italian embassy in Washington and explained what he was doing, and they hung up on him. He called the Italian consulate in LA 10 years later, and they hung up on him. His grandson contacted us and sent us photographs, and we could tell what library they'd come from, and those are now back at the library. Very, very special moment as well. So you see these extraordinary experiences of World War II veterans, American veterans, in the twilight of their life, trying to do more good. Incredibly heartwarming. And here at the museum, a wonderful lady whose father was in the 101st Airborne donated this tapestry to the museum, and I saw this and thought, you know, that's a problem. That's cultural property. And in fact, this had hung in the eagle's nest and had been taken down and shipped back to the United States. And so it was a wonderful moment when we were able to return this tapestry to the museum in Bavaria, where it had been at one time owned by a Jewish dealer. And just recently, a little less than 2 years ago, I returned these two drawings to the National Museum of Poland in Warsaw. And unbeknownst to us when we found them, they were part of a series of drawings, and they had all the other drawings, but these had been stolen by the Nazis when they left Warsaw after the uprising, and hidden in castles in Germany. And then in the closing days of the war, the Nazis, wonderful guys that they are, decided we're going to open the doors, and whatever's here, come and get it. So local citizens went in and took things, and things disappeared. Not everything, but they ended up with a soldier's family in New Mexico, and we were able to get them back to Poland. So these are such important stories describing things that we've found, more than 40 objects, and there's a common denominator to all of it. Every one of these things was in the hands of a World War II veteran or family of a World War II veteran somewhere in the United States that really wanted to do good, but they didn't know who to call. They didn't know how to go about doing that. And that's one of the resources that the foundation provides. We don't charge anybody for our services. If people want to do it anonymously, that's fine with us. But we honor our veterans and thank them for coming forward, and many times they're involved in the restitution ceremonies, and they're very, very special moments to be able to reunite these things and right a wrong of World War II that we can do something about. There are many works of art that are missing, hundreds of thousands, worth billions of dollars, that we do not know where they are. So one of the things the foundation did was to create a deck of playing cards following in the tradition of American military. We've used them recently in Iraq to identify the bad guys. So we've identified works of art that are missing, that we have every reason to believe are out there. They've popped up on an auction market in the last 20 or 30 years. We have information there. There are rewards associated with the decks of cards. They're for sale here at the museum. We have some here afterwards with the books. And there are works of art that we do know where they are. This is a painting by Bernardo Bellotto that's in the Houston Museum of Fine Arts that was looted and recovered by the Monuments Men. It was returned erroneously to the wrong person, ultimately found its way to the museum, and they do not want to return the work of art. So they're all different kinds of challenges that we face trying to right these wrongs of World War II. So if anyone watching online, anyone in the audience has something that they wonder may have been brought back that's cultural property, we're not interested in bayonets and helmets and uniforms and that kind of thing unless they're historically important. But you've seen the kinds of objects that we are looking for, and we always appreciate those leads and getting them back. Now, I said this was a never-ending story. Why did I say that? Because whether we're talking about things that the Nazis have looted, ISIS, or things that are happening in Ukraine today by Russia, whether we're talking about the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas by Al-Qaeda, whether it's a destruction of venerated Islamic texts by Al-Qaeda in Timbuktu, the destruction of an Assyrian slate in Baghdad, the destruction of what remained of Palmyra by ISIS in 2019, or damage and destruction that's going on today in Ukraine, in this library. People around the world care about their cultural treasures. People in Ukraine are trying to move works of art out of the path of war to preserve them and protect sculpture in public areas that can't be moved, just like the Italians did 80 years ago when they entombed Michelangelo's David and the adjacent sculpture by the slaves in brick to try and protect it in the event the roof of the Accademia was bombed. Some people think that they don't really care about art, or culture doesn't matter to them. And yet, do you remember where you were when you saw this in 2019? My wife and I were in a restaurant. People called us and said, turn the television set on, and we didn't have to because it was already on. And you could hear the sobs of people at the bar eating lunch. They probably didn't even know much about Notre Dame. But everybody could see this and say, this is a bad thing. This is not good. Because these things matter, they belong to all of us. They may be in France, they may be in some other country, but it's part of our shared cultural heritage. It's the roadmap of how we got here, and it can be instructional on how we figure out where we're headed. We're really proud about the fact that now, after 20 years of advocacy, haranguing, complaining, the United States Army has, for the first time since World War II, reestablished a Monuments Men and Women Corps. They have an Army Monuments Officer training program. It started 2 years ago in conjunction with the Smithsonian. There are a number of people that are responsible for this. We've been there using the platform that we have to argue the advocacy of this, and it's been great because not only do we have American men and women that have volunteered, but they're also helping train soldiers from other countries. I've been fortunate to be involved as the commencement speaker 2 years ago, and then more recently was there this summer. There were 7, you see the photo of 6, but there were 7 soldiers from Ukraine that were there. Very, very proud to be there. And of course, you can't help but feel for them. A couple of days in a really nice city and some nice hotels with warm meals, and then right back into the soup once they headed back to Ukraine. I want to briefly share with you in closing, before I take your questions. We've talked a lot about things, objects, but what drives us are people. The Monuments Men and Women, and all of the names of people that we'll never know who helped preserve these things and move them out of harm's way even before we had boots on the ground over there. And I'd like to briefly introduce you to the 20 monuments officers that I was fortunate to know who trusted me to be able to tell their story and provided me with the privilege of a lifetime. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
With that, it's my prerogative and my pleasure to not ask a question, but to point out that I'd like to recognize a dear friend of mine and of the museums, the president of the Monuments Men and Women Foundation, and Robert's wife, holding one of her 2 kids, Rodney, and big brother Francesco next to him, Anna Bottinelli Edsel, who cannot stand because her youngest is in her lap.
This is my Roger Federer center court moment to have the boys for the first time at one of my presentations. So it's very, very special to have them here with us today.
Now we can get to the questions.
Yeah.
Hands up, please. We'll start to your right, Robert, about halfway back. Joe, can you pass? Thank you.
Mr. Edsel, it's a pleasure having you speak again. I heard you speak the last time you were here. Very simple question. The books that you originally wrote, The Monuments Men and Saving Da Vinci, are you going to do an update of those books, the 2nd or 3rd edition, that will give us an idea of what else you found since the original books were written?
After Nick's through with his Nick's folly, we'll maybe have Robert's folly, and I'll come along and do that. I think that might be in my memoirs at some point in time, but hopefully that's way, way down the road. Paul Hilliard's such a role model for all of us. Seems like we've got many, many more years in front of us of work. So you can visit the foundation website and find out all the details about all of these objects that we've found, and then return to these various countries or individuals or churches or archives. We are just very, very busy with, this challenging effort that we have with cultural treasures under threat in war zones today, trying to make sure people understand that this is important. And the world that we grew up in has changed in so many ways, not the least of which is no government in the world has enough money to take care of all of the things that they've got. The Notre Dame fire was horrific, but there's 400 Gothic cathedrals in France, which aren't being upkept like they should. And so it's just it's not going to change unless people, you, and citizens everywhere in the world let elected leaders know this is a priority, this is important. We have to do a better job taking care of these things.
And I'd also say that new titles sell a lot better than revised editions, unless you're an academic textbook and you're the professor who wrote it. Next question is going to be to your right, towards the back, Robert.
Is there one particular painting or piece of art that you would more than anything else like to find?
Well, the holy grail of paintings is a painting by Raphael, which we profile at the museum's Monuments Men and Women Gallery, a Portrait of a Gentleman, it's called, which was looted by Nazi General Hans Frank, who was the Governor General of Poland. He left there and had the Leonardo Lady with an Ermine and a painting by Rembrandt and this painting by Raphael in a vehicle. And when we arrested him in Germany on May 3rd or 4th, he still had the Leonardo and he had the Rembrandt, but the Raphael was gone. So we know it wasn't destroyed in battle. There are all sorts of stories that proliferate about it. I've spoken to Hans Frank's relatives, and there are just a lot of different theories, but it's out there somewhere. And part of what we do is try and raise as much visibility about all these missing works of art as we can, including using new technologies with some announcements we'll have in the coming months to basically decommercialize the value to anyone that's got them by making them so obvious that no one would think of having them in their collection because they can't sell them anymore. So that's a big challenge that we face, but that's part of our effort.
Next question's all the way to your left, all the way to the back, please, with Connie.
So you've framed this on trying to get lost works back. What about the budding issue of repatriation? You know, getting the works of art that we kind of know are there back to who they belong to.
Well, that returning works of art to their rightful owners is exactly what we do, and one of the things that we do is there's a thing called Washington Principles, which were it's like an honor bar, verbal set of guidelines that museums in the United States and in 43 other countries agreed to try and make it easier for people that are looking for works of art to recover them without having to go through all the legal hoops and expense of doing so. And the degree of compliance is erratic. Some museums have done an outstanding job at great expense to comply with those guidelines, and some museums think, ain't my problem, I'll deal with it if I end up having a problem. And we try and bring visibility to those museums to encourage them to comply and set the standard, because you heard General Eisenhower say it. In a democracy, at least, there always stands beyond the materialism and destructiveness of war those ideals for which we fought. Ideals aren't like sushi. They don't go bad after 2 days. We lost 415,000 Americans fighting for these ideals, including the respect of law, the respect of cultural property of others, and the right to private property ownership. It applied then. General Eisenhower, when he after the war was over, he made a statement, and we included this quote on the Congressional Gold Medal. It is our privilege. He didn't say duty, and he was pretty particular about the words he chose. He didn't say duty. He said it's our privilege to pass on to future generations treasures of past ages. He considered it an honor to be doing the work that the Monuments Men and Women were doing, and it happened because General Marshall here realized from an optics standpoint how bad it was looking that we were by accident bombing churches, and some of that could be moderated. And he and General Eisenhower understood it was important that we show that we're not going to do what the Nazis did. And the people it was most important to show it to were the German people. That these works of art, they're not in your museums, but we're not taking them back to the United States. We're here preserving them until your museums are rebuilt, and you can see them then. So it's a high watermark, and it stands in such great stead for our country, and something we should be very, very proud about. But why in the world do we want to cede or yield that moral high ground to having no monuments officers or not caring about these things? We need all the friends in the world we can get. In my view of the world, demonstrating respect for the cultural property that's in other countries is one way about going to do it. Richard Nixon used ping pong to be able to open the doors to China. So there are a lot of different ways to go about getting to where we need to be. Other questions?
We're going to go to your right, pretty much right in front of you, Robert.
I'm wondering if you work with any of the big auction houses, art auction houses like Sotheby's, to help identify some of these if they happen upon them.
We do work with Sotheby's and Christie's. We have good relationships with both of them and some other auction houses you've not mentioned. They have extensive provenance researchers there at both companies. They are the most conscientious they've ever been about this because they realize it's a bad look for them to ever be selling something that there's a claim to. Now, most of the focus there is on paintings, and paintings for a reason, because the Nazi inventory codes were written on the backs of these paintings in many instances, and they may still be there. And the front of a painting is what the artist put there. The back of the painting is where the story is. Who painted it? Who looted it? Who lost it in a divorce? Who had it stolen from them? Who went broke and had to dump it? How many different owners have there been? When was it exhibited? And in the case of the Nazis, I'll give them credit for this, they were pretty good documenters of their looting and noting who they'd taken it from. And it allowed, as the great scholar Lynn Nicholas said, for the theft to be run in reverse. The Monuments Men and Women could use that to figure out where these things were taken from and how to get them back. The problem comes when we deal with the greater problem, not only paintings still, but tapestries, there's no markings, small objects, sculpture typically doesn't have things, but this is where the Signal Corps has done a great service for us, because World War II is the most documented, photographed, filmed event in history. And you go to the National Archives, and it's beyond overwhelming, the documents and the evidence they have. And I'll say, the National World War II Museum is giving them a run now. I mean, it's extraordinary what they have collected here. And the Monuments Men and Women Foundation library now resides here alongside Stephen Ambrose books, Paul Hilliard's library, and others, and we're very, very proud about that. It's all here, available to researchers to come and see all this information that we've gathered, including our oral histories with the Monuments Men and Women. All these things are here at the National World War II Museum. This is our museum. It's where the headquarters for that part of our work resides, and we're very, very proud about that.
Robert, the far right, halfway back, please.
Thank you very much again, Robert. I was curious as to whether any similar efforts are being made regarding thefts by the Japanese during the war.
Good question about the Pacific. The monuments effort, as you could see, begins in Italy. It actually begins in North Africa on a de facto basis. The British had soldiers who were museumologists, and they went around telling British soldiers that were giddy about putting their names on important sculpture or structures in Libya and other areas, Leptis Magnum. Bad idea, don't do that. And when the United States had the idea to create a formal organization, the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives section, that was going to be part of the Civil Affairs, Sir Kenneth Clark, who was director of the National Gallery in London, said precisely, great idea, period, it will never work. Because he didn't believe the Army would ever listen to anything anyone told him. Well, that turned out wrong. And in fact, the fact that these monuments officers were mid-40s dealing with superior officers who were half their age, in fact, the age of the students that they'd been teaching at college. And they understood we can't order them or tell them what to do, but we can inspire them to do it. And they found, in many instances, not all, that they were able to steer Allied bombing away from areas that cultural targets were threatened. They could convince battlefield commanders not to shoot the top off of a church just because there was a sniper in the tower, and other things like that. And then they effected temporary repairs. So, does that respond to your question? I hope so.
Robert, to your right in the front, please.
Robert, that was a fabulous and profound presentation.
Thank you.
And we all appreciate your passion. This may be a difficult question for you to answer, but in your exploration of Europe, can you give us a couple of anecdotes that really brought you down to your knees?
Let me do this. As to your question about the Pacific, I left off the answer to your question. What you saw happen in Western Europe, we had boots on the ground. Japan, of course, by the time we had control of the mainland, the war was over. And so there were monuments officers, about 6 or 7. They called it Arts and Monuments Division, working in General MacArthur's headquarters. George Stout actually was so fed up with everybody claiming, I found this, I did this in Europe, that he left and came back to the States. I think he'd worked 2 years in a row without a day off. And he lasted about 3 months before he thought public service. And he got on a ship and went to the Pacific and worked in Tokyo. So he was a key figure. But the job there was really to protect objects from theft and destruction by the people there, by soldiers. And there were monuments officers from British Empire countries that understood Asian countries better than the United States. They were in Korea, they were in Cambodia and Thailand and other countries like that. So they were there, it was a very different kind of operation. As to things that bring me to my knees, You know, I've been so fortunate to see so many works of art. I've seen things all of you all have seen or had a chance to see. I've seen things few people get in to see and up close. But the things that bring me to my knees are a monuments officer sharing with me the intimate details of their experience. I'll tell you a brief story and conclude with this. When we were traveling with the film cast, showing the film, we were in Berlin, Milan, as you saw, London, and in Paris. And we were in London the day after Milan, and all 7 or 8 actors were up on stage, and they went down and they asked the question someone asked earlier, is there one work of art that really sticks in your mind? And of course, it went Leonardo's Last Supper, Leonardo's Last Supper, Leonardo, because we'd just finished seeing it right there in front of it. And they got down to Bill Murray, and everyone started laughing before Bill even said anything. And he said, when I was a young actor, I was in Chicago, and I worked on stage, and I was in this play, and I was horrible. I was really, really bad. In fact, I was so bad, I thought, that's it. I'm going to end it. And I started walking around. I walked out of the theater, and I started walking, figuring, okay, well, I'll do it in the water. I'll start walking towards Lake Michigan. And I got disoriented. Everybody was laughing the whole time. And he said, I got disoriented, and I found myself, I looked up, and there was the Art Institute in Chicago. And I walked in, and there was this painting. And there was this woman, it didn't look like she had much prospects for her life, working out in the field, and the sun was rising behind her, and I thought, well, you know, I'm a person like her, and, you know, she had another tomorrow, and I'll have another tomorrow too. Well, of course, I'm sitting there with my phone writing my staff, find that damn painting. But everybody had tears in their eyes. And by the time we got on the plane to go to Paris for the last one, we had the painting. It was a painting by Millet of a woman working in a field. It was exactly like he said. So that's the power of art. That's the power of art. It reminds us that there's things that are bigger than we are, and we should always keep that in mind, more important than the achievements and even things that we should embrace and make sure we don't lose.
Robert, we have time for one last question, please. We'll go to your left to the front.
My friend.
As always, great presentation, and I've read your books, and they're fantastic, and I think everybody's ready for more. So what are you up to these days? What's on your horizon?
Well, we've, of course, got our hands full with the Monuments Men and Women Foundation. We've actually had a lot of time freed up because we're finally finished with the Monuments Men and Women Gallery, dotting every I and crossing every T, as was mentioned earlier. And, but I'm being called into a different direction. I'm so kindly complimented about, it's great that you found the story of the Monuments Men. I didn't find it, it found me. I'm the messenger. It's your story. These things belong to all of us. And it was a leap of faith that I followed that has led to this remarkable journey and is allowing us to continue to further preserve these men and women's legacy. But I've been called in a different direction now about a story involving World War II that is not about art, but is about something even more important, and that is our freedom. And I've been working on a book for the last 6 years, and we're almost through with the first draft of it. It will be out in the spring 2025 to coincide with the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. And it really is worth saying again these words of General Eisenhower: in a democracy at least, there always stands beyond the materialism and destructiveness of war those ideals for which it was fought. And there can't be a more meaningful, important ideal than our freedom. And this book is about how beautiful and meaningful that freedom is to all of us, especially those of us who didn't do a damn thing to earn it. It's about how horrible it is to lose your freedom. It's about how difficult it is to get it back. Ask the Ukrainians. And what do you do if you're fortunate enough to get it back, and the people who got it back for you aren't there to thank anymore? And that's the story. So I look forward to sharing it with all of you all. We're hard at work on it. It will have consumed 8 or 9 years of my life by the time we're finished. But I think all of us hope to live a virtuous life of humility like Paul Hilliard, what we saw earlier. And I think we all hope to be remembered somehow, some way by somebody. And that's what this story's about. I thank you so much.